Well, here we are again. You know, I don't know when these are going to get posted because I'm going to be leaving for Halloween Horror Nights again tonight in a little bit. And I probably won't be able to post all of these videos today. So I might get one or two of them. So God knows when you'll actually get me talking about 1999. Maybe tomorrow. Anyway, let's continue. I was just mentioning that Getz didn't like horror movies. And so he ended them, that's right. That's why around 1947, Universal made no horror movies. The company that had sort of built its brand on horror made no horror movies at all in 1947. In fact, almost no studio in Hollywood made any horror movies in 1947. Isn't that weird? Then, however, or was that 46? 1946, whatever year it was. Then, there was a problem. What happened? Well, let's just say the box office went. Getz failed. He failed terribly. And so, there was more restructuring, and in the late 40s we saw the return of what made Universal work. Comedies, such as Abbott and Costello movies, and the horror films, and they actually thought, well, let's put them together. And that's why we had Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which was sort of the big kiss-off to the whole thing with bringing old Bela Lugosi back from obscurity to star as Dracula for one last time. And it was pretty cool, actually, in some ways. It's not quite as bad as some people think. It's actually, considering how campy the films got in the Universal International era with some of those others. So, here we are. Rank decided to sell his stocks in Universal. And thus Universal became an American company again, under Milton Rackmill, who was at Decca Records. Decca Records then purchased Universal, and now for the first time we have music company running a studio. This would be a trend which would continue for many years, actually. Milton decided to make more science fiction movies. It was the 1950s now, and 1952, like I said, and the atom age. People were concerned about communists, and they were concerned about aliens and flying saucers, and about all of these atomic bombs. And so the science fiction horror films started to debut, including what is considered one of the great Universal classic monsters, the Creature from the Black Lagoon in 1953. So that's how that happened. And a lot of other great science fiction movies from that era, you know, Tarantula and The Incredible Shrinking Man, and a whole lot of other films, The Mole People, all of these came out around that era. But then something else started to happen in the 1950s that rocked Universal, and that was this little box people started buying and putting in the living rooms called television. And many of the studios thought, oh my God, this is going to kill the movie industry. There were a couple of people who were really smart in the motion picture industry and understood that television could be used as a means to promote what they're doing in movies. Disney was one, Hitchcock was another, and they not only utilized it, but they put themselves on television, hosting programs, and turned themselves into celebrities like the movie stars that appeared in the movies. This is why Hitchcock became the director that everyone knew what he sounded and looked like, and was brand. Disney as well. I mean, nobody really knew what your average studio. I mean, you know, if what's his name, Mervyn LeRoy. No, that's not the right name. Louis B. Mayer or somebody walked down the street, people wouldn't say. People wouldn't recognize him. But Walt Disney, they'd seen him on TV every Sunday night. You know, Alfred Hitchcock, they'd seen him hosting his show. And so they became celebrities themselves. They knew how to use that television to promote themselves and to make their motion pictures more popular. It took a while for the rest of the world to catch up. Well, television began to frighten them, and Universal was starting to really get shaky, and the company and Decca were owned was falling apart. Well, guess who bought out, who started getting involved? Another music company, the Music Corporation of America, MCA, which also happened to be a major television producer at that time. And they stepped in. There was a man named Lew Wasserman who organized this. They bought, in 1958, the Universal Studio lot. Now, Universal Studios could still use the lot to make movies, and they did, but now television programs are being made on that lot, and they would also let other people come in and use that lot from other productions, such as Alfred Hitchcock, who started filming films on Universal even before those films were released by you. Psycho in 1960 was released by Paramount, okay? Eventually, Hitchcock, when he had those films, because Shamley actually owned those films, but it was just released by Paramount. But when Hitchcock re-released them later in the 60s, they released them as Universal Pictures, and eventually they all reverted to Universal, so they won out in the end. But so this was going on. But in 1962, MCA had become so powerful they could buy the rest of the studio as well. So now it was no longer Universal and someone else is using their lot. Now Universal and their lot all were part of MCA, the Music Corporation of America. And this continued for a very long time, well into the 1970s. So this big black tower that you see in Hollywood was built, and that's where MCA ran everything from Universal Pictures. And because of this, more and more Universal started going towards television instead of movies. They were making movies, but the television program, a lot more television. And in the early 70s, they made more television, and they made some great TV programs. And that's how Steven Spielberg got into everything. That's how he started. He was making television movies for Universal, like Duel and like the pilot for Night Gallery, and and that was also the era of the $6 Million Man, but all kinds of other terrific TV programs are being shot at Universal. Now, before we go any further, in 1968, MCA also bought something else, which became a part of their vast corporate. They bought a retail gift shop called Spencer's. This would be important later on as well. Now, by the mid-1970s, Universal suddenly, because of that Spielberg character, he made a movie called Jaws, and it became the #1 box office hit of all time. Universal was back in the movie business in a big way. They've been making movies all along, but now they're making blockbuster movies that everyone was seeing. And this continued with E.T. the Extraterrestrial in 1982, and then in 1985, Back to the Future, and hit after hit started coming out. And so now Universal became a movie company again, not just a television company that would, so that changed the whole thing. And eventually they started to compete with Disney and opened up theme parks, turning the Universal Studios tour into a theme park in Hollywood, and in 1990 opening Universal Studios Orlando, Universal Studios Florida, here in Orlando, Florida. Yes, so we see how the history of how that all happened. Okay, now very interesting happened in November of 1990, nearly a year before Fright Nights. MCA itself, the whole company, was purchased by the Japanese. A Japanese company called Matsushita bought MCA. So now the Japanese, above Wasserman, were running things from Japan. And they had a lot, and that was when Fright Nights started in 1991. So when Fright Nights began, the company was run by the Japanese. I don't know if there's any connection there, but there might have been. Some Sarariman from Japan might have come over to look at what they're doing and say, yes, do that. No, do this. You never know. It could have been. But it was a bad fit, and it was a very rocky relationship. And so things started to change, and this is interesting. In 1995, Matsushita sold to another foreign company, Seagram's, a beverage company from Canada run by a man named Bronfman. And so Edgar Bronfman began running the whole schmeal of MCA, including Universal Studios. And it was in 1995 that we do notice a big change happening with Halloween Horror Nights. Now, I don't know if Bronfman got into Halloween Horror Nights in a way that, the Japanese couldn't get. But he understood that this was something cool, perhaps, because that's when things started kicking off. That's when we had the Crypt Keeper. That's when we started having more houses. That's when we started having more cross-corporate promotion, such as having in 1998 Chucky and Tiffany getting hitched at the park at the same time their movie, Bride of Chucky, was playing. And so in 1999, this continued, this sort of thing. And I wonder if Bronfman might have had some influence on the way these events were happening at Halloween Horror Nights during this era. And I'll continue looking at this in future videos because I've caught up with myself. It's now 1999. A couple other things happened in 1999 that are really significant as we get into my actual discussion of the event of Last Gasp. Yes, you see, I mentioned Spencer's Gifts. In 1999, Spencer's Gifts, which was still a part of MCA and thus part of Universal, Seagram's empire, purchased a British firm called Spirit Entertainment. No, actually, Spirit Halloween Superstores. And thus, retailing Halloween became a part of Universal's corporate family at the same time that they were beginning bigger and bigger Halloween events at Universal Studios Florida. So we've got more corporate synergy. We've got Halloween stores selling Halloween stuff all over the country along with the big Halloween event. See, Halloween was becoming, in other words, Universal was really beginning to own Halloween totally in the year 1999. Now, with that, I can proceed to other things that happened in 1999 that are very, very significant. I may have mentioned in an earlier video that there was a permanent haunted attraction in Orlando, Florida from 1991 called Terror on Church Street. And it was like Halloween Horror Nights all year round in one building. You'd go in and you'd go through, and one time I actually went there sometime around 97, 96, I forget what year. It was after they first put Freddy Krueger in. And you would go into various rooms, and it was something like Halloween in a way, because it was pulse, but your group would go into a room, and you'd be in this weird room, and suddenly a character, they didn't call them that, but it's the same thing, would pop up and say something frightening or do something scary, attack you. You'd go in like Dracula in one room, the Phantom of the Opera in another room would have a wolf man or an evil clown. Interesting, an evil clown. There was the Texas Chainsaw Man and the Freddy Krueger. And that Freddy Krueger room was freaking awesome because that Krueger would stalk your ass. And I remember, being the last person in the group, and we actually saw him and he chased us out of the room. And then we're going through the sort of hallway in the boiler room, and I had this creepy feeling. I turned around, and he's right behind me, still following me, and he's not giving up. And it's like, holy crap, he's gonna hunt me down and get me. Fuck. But it was really awesome. But eventually, it failed, and it failed in 1999. In May of 1999, they closed themselves down, and they had all these costumes and sets and props, and they had an auction. And guess who bought like 90% of all of that stuff? Universal. That's right. They acquired a huge collection of horror movie and horror themed sets, costumes, props, and all kinds of stuff that had been at Terror at Church Street, and it became part of their supply to put on Halloween Horror Nights. So now they had all of this stuff they could use. And that's why in 1999, some of this stuff started to be used, and you started to see this at Halloween Horror Nights. Creepy clowns and rather neat gothic scenes. This time I must answer the phone. So, next video is in a few minutes.